Okay, we're in Horsham, and Simon here has come to talk to us about battling our way through Total War Warhammer, the upcoming fantasy strategy game from Creative Assembly. Total War Warhammer is going to be a huge departure within the fairly strict confines of a well-established series. What is going to be the most fundamental difference between the historical battles that you've been working on for all these years and these new fantasy-themed battles that you're building now?
How long have we got? It is huge difference compared to previous battles. Like we were chatting the other day, we were saying like we have done more changes to the battle system in Warhammer than we have in actually any previous product that we've done. So, for example, you've got all these new mechanics coming in, such as the magic system. So you have casters on the battlefield who are actually able to kind of throw spells out there based on the Warhammer lore and actually kind of buff or debuff enemies or use vortexes to kind of kill enemy troops, things like that. Like, there's lots of new variety there, as well as character abilities that can be used on the battlefield, which are kind of inbuilt into your character as you level them up through the campaign map. We also now have the addition of flying units, which has a kind of really interesting new tactical vibe to it. Like we use it quite a lot in the office for just kind of leaping over a line. So you've got two lines fighting and you can actually use your flying units to kind of dive over and get that kind of rear charge attack in and actually break enemy units with it. So that's a really interesting new point. And I think another thing that maybe we've not even talked about enough is actually the Lords and Heroes and their effect, right? These are a single entity unit on the battlefield who have insane amount of hit points, insane damage, and are really kind of powerful leaders of your army and are actually kind of very important part of your battle line. So you're not leaving them in the kind of back anymore. They're not a kind of a Napoleon-style general who kind of sits there and waits for the army to win the battle for him. They're actually in the fray, dealing damage and actually helping to win the battle themselves.
With the historical games, I mean, the armies were different. There's no denying that, but quite often the differences were fairly subtle. But here we are talking about different factions with completely different sets of units, not just reskins, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but some of them there was an element of reskinning in some of the previous units, but that doesn't look like it's going to be the case here at all.
No, not at all. I mean, previously, as you say, we would have kind of sets of armors and weapons and things, and we'd be equipping out different units with those items. With Warhammer, actually, it's a complete departure from that, in that every single unit is handcrafted by our artists and our animation team, and actually kind of comes to life in that way because they've got their own animations, their own style. So like a zombie will move and look completely different to kind of a human empire swordsman, for example, and stuff like that. But then as well as that then moves into the way that the armies fight, right? Because the greenskins, for example, lots of kind of fast moving units. So you've got like the Wolf Riders, you've got Savage Orc Boar Boys, things like that. Like their combat style also changes because of that. So it's not just an artistic change, it's actually a kind of mechanics change as well. So each race's battlefield tactics, they've got things that they're strong at and things that they're not so strong at. So, for example, certain races don't have much in the way of ranged attack, right? So they're all about getting in close, dealing as much damage as possible, and then sort of preventing the enemy from using their own ranged units to actually outclass them.
Okay, the biggest departure from my eyes as well, from somebody who hasn't been involved with developing the game, would you agree that magic is going to be kind of a fundamental game changer to the formula?
It's certainly a battle changer, quite a lot. It's very impactful. But once again, as I've kind of said in previous interviews and stuff, it's all about using it at the right time. So it is a powerful and it is a game changer, right? Like a vortex spell can wipe out maybe 2 or 3 enemy units in a single blast if it's kind of well placed and you get the luck of the roll, because vortexes travel in random directions. So you place it, but then it will go where it wants. So if you're lucky, you can deal loads of damage to the enemy, or even if you're unlucky, to yourself. But basically that's kind of going to have a big impact. Like if you bunch your units up in big lines, that's when you can get punished by magic spells, bombardments, vortexes, stuff like that. So you kind of have to be aware as a player that spells are going to be cast upon you and kind of change your strategy to adapt to that. If you're fighting a largely kind of spell-based army, similar to like the Vampire Counts or something like that, you're going to have to stay spread out because you don't want to get caught in one of their magic spells. But then also with yourself, you've got your spells and you've got to go, right, there's an opportunity here. I can take down these particular units using this spell, so I'll use it at that point, use my Winds of Magic. I won't be able to cast it again for quite a while, but potentially I may have changed a losing battle into a heroic victory.
I mean, that kind of risk-reward, that that does echo the kind of the dice roll, and obviously that must be something that you're constantly thinking about. With the dice roll mechanic, how have you kind of reconciled that kind of fundamental difference between the tabletop and the fact that, I mean, I've heard the line from people at the studio before, this is first and foremost a Total War game. How have you reconciled those kind of fundamental differences?
Well, I think once again, like we look at Total War and what Total War is, and then we've taken Warhammer and, like, kind of as you just said, like we kind of concentrated a lot more on the lore side of Warhammer and the mechanics that the creatures bring, and try and kind of transpose that into the Total War systems. But actually there are a lot of things where we are almost kind of simulating the dice rolls, like especially with the spell system. So like the vortexes and their random directions, that's the same as your scatter dice, right? So you roll your scatter dice, your direction, it'll move in that random position, it does it that way. And then for things like the Doomdiver catapult, which we've shown off quite a few times and I really love, like you take control of it and you kind of launch where it goes. So you've got a little flight sim that you're playing as you're sort of going through, and that's kind of really interesting. But it kind of simulates Warhammer a little bit in that you get similar effects, like your Doomdiver, you aim it and then it can move certain distances based on die rolls and things like that. So we've kind of really taken out the die rolls, as it were, but kept the mechanics that sort of underlie that system, which I think is quite nice.
Okay, one of the things that you mentioned earlier that you said perhaps you haven't spoken enough about, so lucky you get to talk about it some more, would be the kind of the legendary heroes. What can you tell us about those, the kind of the mechanics that govern those units, particularly obviously with a battle focus?
So like these guys are, as I said, like they are the leaders of your forces, right? They're going to be in charge of everything that goes on. They are the kind of core of your army on the battlefield, as it were, right? So without them, your armies will fall apart, especially so in certain factions' cases. But they are a single hero. They have so much, their health pool is larger than most units on the battlefield single-handedly, so they are able to hold up and fight against pretty much any other unit on the battlefield, but, you know, especially good against other lords and heroes and stuff like that. But then as they level up on the campaign, they're going to be unlocking abilities. These are going to be your guys who are changing the game. So you've got to remember, wizards as well are your hero characters, or your lords in some cases. So Balthasar Gelt of the Empire, for example, is the kind of wizard of the High Colleges of Magic in Altdorf. He's got spells that you're unlocking on the campaign map and skills that add to that. And those skills are giving large buffs to your entire army, right? Like this could be like damage bonuses and things like that. Like they could be improving your army as a whole by their mere presence. But of course then losing them could be quite destructive, right? Because you're not actually going to have all those buffs and bonuses anymore. They all get stripped away. So you've got to kind of keep him alive, but also realize that he is also your best unit on the battlefield, right? So without him, you're not going to be winning those battles. So they're really important to kind of use at the right time. And once again, it's that kind of risk-reward mechanic coming into play, where it's sort of like, do I commit this guy to a combat that I know he can't win, but him getting into that combat helps me win the rest of the battle, or kind of other situations that you could think of.
Okay, the legendary heroes, they certainly stamp a bit of individuality to the armies, and you're working with, in this first part of the trilogy, you're working with 4 distinct factions. Obviously, there is a long version to this and a short version, but what are the kind of the fundamental differences between the 4 factions, if you kind of had to kind of sum it up in a nutshell?
So kind of with their battle play styles, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. So the Empire, very much, they've got a little bit of everything, and they're really good at what they do. So they've got really good infantry, good ranged units, excellent cavalry, like the Reichsguard and the Demigryph Knights, for example, are absolutely insane. They're really, really powerful. They have really good lords and heroes, people like warrior priests, witch hunters, led by Karl Franz, who, as he levels up, eventually gets Deathclaw, so he becomes an actual flying unit. They don't have much in the way of flying units, but Karl Franz represents that kind of side of them. So they're a really nice, balanced faction that sit in a quite kind of central area of the world. Then you've got the Dwarfs. So the Dwarfs generally much smaller army sizes, right? Like the number of units in their armies is much lower than other factions because there's fewer Dwarfs, right? But actually those few units have the strength of 2 men, as it were. So although you're less mobile and you're not really going to be very good at flanking an enemy, for example, because your force is always smaller, flanking opportunities are going to be much lower, much fewer, but also your risk of being flanked are higher. But then the Dwarfs have very, very strong infantry. So they're not going to deal high damage, but they've got very good sustain, right? They'll be able to hold a combat for a long time, while their artillery and ranged units, which actually deal all their damage, are going to be pounding away at the enemy forces. So for the Dwarfs, it's a lot about playing defensively and kind of holding back from attacking the enemy units. Then kind of thirdly, you've got the greenskins. So the greenskins are the exact opposite of the dwarfs, basically. They're all about having more guys than you. They're all about having lots of kind of throwaway units, but a few very strong units. So you've got the monsters like the Arachnarok and the Giant and things like that all come into combat. And they're very much about getting into the enemy, hitting them hard, getting lots of flanking attacks in, and just sort of destroying them quickly before the kind of overtime. They haven't got much sustain as an army. So basically they've got to win quickly, otherwise they'll start getting broken down by enemy forces. And then finally vampire counts. Vampire counts rely very, very heavily on magic, right? You've got lots of throwaway units, lots of units that like zombies and skeletons and things like that, but then actually they're very reliant on their magic to keep their armies alive, sustained and still going, but also like they've got really strong flying units as well, right? Like they've got like fellbats and units like that. So actually they're extremely good at, once again, just sort of kind of breaking down an enemy through sheer kind of number of forces once again. Like they've got excellent flying units to take down enemy heroes and assassinate them, but then their spellcasters really change the tide of the battle in their favour. So their army could look weak, but actually through the spellcasting they become extremely strong and then eventually wear down the enemy.
What does that mean for the kind of multiplayer side of the game? Is that something that you're exploring and balancing?
So I think like all armies are going to be able to take on multiple roles, right? So all races will have different roles that they can play. It's simply what I was describing there were kind of the best roles, you know, like the strongest playstyles and stuff like that. And it's going to become about, for the multiplayer experience, I really hope it'll be about knowing your enemy a little bit, but then also knowing yourself and what you're going to be strong at. So if you're playing as the dwarfs against the greenskins, don't try and sort of charge around them and try and get into a flanking attack, because the greenskins will do much better than you at that sort of tactic. So although all races are balanced against one another, it's sort of to get the most out of them, to kind of really squeeze all the juice out, you should really be playing with certain kind of styles that they're stronger at supporting, and like their unit makeups will sort of help guide you towards what style of gameplay that you want to play with. But there's still opportunities to play in other styles as well with each faction. Okay,
so there is a fundamental difference between the normal battles and the quest battles. Can you tell us a little bit about how those quest battles work? Because you're going into battle with kind of predefined armies, is that correct?
So the quest battles are an interesting kind of new take on what would previously have been historical battles in older Total War titles. So basically, your legendary lords are able to undertake quests through their skill tree on the campaign map. So the quest could be, for example, Karl Franz Galmaraz, his Warhammer. So he takes the quest, he gets a series of missions that he has to complete, and then the final mission of this is to actually fight a quest battle. Now, these are at preset locations around the world, and you have to journey to them. So kind of, you know, there's sometimes things in the way that you've got to deal with, or maybe a faction whose lands you don't want to move through because you might anger them, but you have to get there, and that's when you fight the battle. When you fight the battle, you bring in your army from the campaign map and your characters. So the way you've leveled Karl Franz and the way you've leveled his Witch Hunter and the way that you've constructed your army is actually what you bring into the battle with you, right? So you kind of have to think a little bit like, how do I win this? What am I up against? Am I up against kind of an army of giants, for example? How would I take those down? What tools do I have at my disposal to win that battle? And then when you enter into that battle, you will actually be fighting a preset army that we have generated, but you'll also get kind of a number of scripted events and things occurring during that to kind of really up the ante a little bit. So things like reinforcements could be coming at you from all directions. You know, you could be completely surrounded by an enemy. Now, this wouldn't normally occur in a standard campaign battle, but for us, we can actually craft these interesting experiences at custom-built locations around the world. So Galmaraz was at Blackfire Pass, for example. So, you know, you've got this custom bespoke area which you can fight on in the campaign map as a regular land battle as well, but this is kind of a special scenario that we've set up for you to actually play. And then once you've won that scenario, you unlock the quest battle item that you would put the skill point in for. So in this one you get Galmaraz, which would make Karl Franz much more effective on the battlefield.
So in a traditional Total War, I mean, you have got these kind of pre-scripted battles available on a separate part of the game, but now you're confronting the player with them and incentivizing them and feeding that into the campaign. Yeah. And you know that people are going to be engaging with these more. Does that...
You bring in your, sorry, I think because you bring in your own army as well, it's a much more personal experience. Yeah. You know, we've cut a challenge off for ourselves, right? It's quite a different thing from bringing in a custom scripted army and the way you balance that to bringing in whatever army the player has decided to bring in at that point. So it's quite fun from that point, but I think it gives you much more kind of feeling of being part of that experience because it is your army, it is your characters, it is your units that you're bringing into that battle. And I think you really get to feel much more a part of the kind of storyline that you're playing through in the game.
but as a designer, as yourself, that must be quite exciting to be able to kind of punctuate the campaign with these bespoke battles. That must be a kind of a unique challenge, and kind of balancing that across the kind of more emergent battles that you would get with kind of players generating their own armies and kind of battling against AI armies that aren't scripted.
I mean, it is a really interesting change to how we normally do Total War. Total War, generally, we concentrate on kind of macro when it comes to doing the battle side stuff, right? So we set up lots of procedural battlefields. They're all running. You can fight in any location in the world. You know, all the units kind of balanced against each other at a micro level, but also we look at it as sort of a grander thing. We don't really build little tiny kind of crafted experiences all that often without the historical battles, which we only ever have a few of. So it's been really interesting that we have a lot of, like, over 40 quest battles coming into this game so far, and then to actually craft these little experiences for players that are also slightly procedural, but have this level of kind of craft and kind of action going on. And we are sitting there kind of playing them in the office and sort of seeing, how do we beat this challenge? How do we play through this experience? So it's actually quite exciting to do something that kind of level design-y almost, if you know what I mean, like scenario design from that perspective, which just then adds into this sort of grand strategy campaign that you're actually playing through as a player.
And so, speaking of level design, you've got underground battles in this. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe if there's any other kind of examples of kind of new battlefields that are kind of going to be relevant to the Warhammer universe that you've managed to kind of bring to the game?
Yeah, of course. So, like, underground battles basically occur when an army in tunneling stance is intercepted or intercepts an enemy army. And then at that point, you kind of all get dragged into the Underway, which is the old series of dwarven roads that lead underneath the old world, basically. You know, they're all through the mountain passes, things like that. And it's literally like a set of warrens, essentially, underneath the world that you can fight in. So, you know, you get pulled into these and you're actually fighting a battle. Now, you're in really close confines, right? It really supports the dwarven playstyle. Because the maps are so narrow and thin, it's very difficult to flank. So actually for the dwarfs, it's like, yeah, this is the best place for us to be fighting at any point, right? As long as they're defending, they've got a kind of strong defensive point that can really hold the line against any enemies who are trying to take them out. So it's a really good place for the dwarfs to fight. It's almost like their battlefield, do you know what I mean? Because the roads are built by the dwarfs as well, so it kind of makes sense from that perspective. And then, yeah, you just fight this battle under that, and then, you know, you go back onto the campaign map after it finishes. But, you know, other battle types, we've kind of still got all the kind of traditional battle types like ambushes, things like that. But then new battlefields have got some really interesting things coming in. We haven't really shown them off yet, but we're going to have some, as well as the custom battle tiles, of course, which are all custom. We're also going to have some really interesting tiles more towards the kind of overground of the mountain passes and things like that. So you're going to be fighting in little mountain passes, kind of these kind of small gullies and valleys that you wouldn't normally have in a Total War game. We've managed to take much more control over the actual size and scale of the battlefields that you fight on. We've actually brought that into the mechanics and gameplay of the area. So, like, when you're fighting as the Greenskins in the Badlands, for example, like, a lot of the battlefields are really big, like really open, really large, and they support your playstyle, right? But when you're fighting in the mountains, it's all dwarfs and stuff like that. So the battlefields, as well as the underways, actually get much thinner, much narrower, and much easier to hold for an army, which kind of really fills into the Warhammer lore, but also gives us some really interesting gameplay kind of like options when we're trying to design levels for the game.
We are just a few months away from launch. How's it going? How's kind of the pieces all coming together now? Are you feeling really confident about the direction that you've taken and the pieces that you put into place?
So actually, since Christmas, it's been quite fantastic, the rate of knots at which kind of changes are going in, and we're balancing things. And we are actually at the stage now where we are doing lots of kind of balancing and getting, as you were discussing with multiplayer, like really trying to hone that kind of gameplay experience now. And that's actually quite an exciting point to be in the project, because we are literally sort of defining the game that people are going to play now. We've got all our mechanics in, all our concepts that we've talked about kind of since we first started kind of announcing Warhammer, basically. But now we're actually getting to that point where we are tightening everything up, kind of tightening the screws, as it were, to kind of really get that kind of key, sweet gameplay spot, which is quite exciting at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, and good luck with the rest of the few months that you have before launch.
Thank you. Cheers.
Time to move, boss. Time to fight. Give the order. Yeah, the order. Say it.